We are discussing the market economy in relation, I think, particularly to where we are, to Central Europe. And I'll begin, we know what Central Europe is, but I'm going to ask an odd question, which is, what is the free market economy? It's sort of interesting because most really important social institutions and customs are so common and present in our lives from our birth that we don't really ask their nature or inquire into how they got there. So look here at the different names we give the free market. They tell us a lot individually and still more in combination. The free market simply means that you are free to buy, sell, and exchange goods and services without let or hindrance. So you're not confined to enjoying what you yourself can produce. You can exchange what you have made for what others have made. That's a very obvious and rather trite truth, apparently. But we forget that within our lifetimes, communism and socialism forbade it in theory and punished it in practice to quite an astounding extent. 1961 isn't long ago, but in 1961, 6 people were executed in the Soviet Union for making and selling pencils, which were in short supply and therefore expensive. If they had the reason for this is very simple. If they'd got away with it, by producing pencils privately and not through the state's apparatus or with the state's permission, then other people would have started making and selling pencils, and the habit might have spread to all kinds of other goods and services, and eventually state control, state monopolies, and this whole system would have been eroded. Now that's sort of obvious, but it has important implications. Shirley Robin Letwin, the American political theorist, pointed out that one of the most important distinctions between a free market society, a liberal society, and a socialist society was that the free market society was perfectly capable of tolerating socialist communes within its overall structure, even if the bulk of the society and official institutions didn't agree with or approve of them. But it was impossible for a socialist society to really allow dissident institutions of that kind. So that's the first point. The free market is free. Secondly, we sometimes call the system free enterprise. Well, that's true as well. I mean, people have gifts, they have energy, they have imagination, they have diligence, they have a curiosity about what other people want. All these things are different ways of thinking about the word enterprise. They mean that some people see more efficient ways of giving people things they want at a lower price. Sometimes they envisage new products that people had never thought of before, and products which no one had thought of actually wanting or desiring before. And that spurs technical innovation and economic development. And moralists often object, but the result of banning such wasteful innovation is a static society and eventually, by comparison, a poor and backward one. It's interesting that one of the first serious debates in the West, in London in the 1880s to the First World War about socialism, was about this very point. People got into the habit of discussing the factors of production as land, labor, and capital. And when you confined the debate to those 3, you could make quite a good socialist argument. But a number of writers, including obviously liberal economists, but also a conservative writer like W.H. Mallock, said, no, there's a 4th factor of production. He called it ability. And what ability is that you simply rearrange the existing factors of production in a new and imaginative way, as a result of which you produce more with less. There was a debate between George Bernard Shaw for the Fabians and Mallock, and Mallock won that debate, to my mind. You often hear that Shaw won it, but in fact, when you actually read the debate, you could see that Shaw was taken to the cleaners, and he thought that himself in private discussions. So free enterprise is enterprising, and that's terribly important too. And then there's Marx's word for the system, namely capitalism. Now, capitalism is an interesting word. It reflects the fact that progress and technical development depend on the availability of money, to finance research, to purchase new labor-saving machinery, to improve the productivity of the actual worker, and overall to create more wealth. That investment is financed, always financed really, if we trace it back far enough, by someone's savings. That's capital, obviously. Now, Marx thought that capitalism was the engine of market economics, but also the product of a crime, namely forcing savings from the proletariat, stealing them. The capitalist was someone who stole savings from the proletariat and invested it on his own behalf. Now, I think capitalism isn't a bad name, but of course Marx was wrong in thinking, as we know, that capital had been stolen from the worker. For that to be true, he would have had to show just what a just or fair wage was. In other words, if the wage you should be getting is £5 a week, and you're getting 4, well, someone's stolen £1 from you. Now, he attempted to do this with the labour theory of value, but that's nonsense. You all know why. And it didn't account for what was happening around him. He had predicted the immiseration of the proletariat, and yet they were growing steadily more prosperous. Actually, there's a wonderful passage in a letter to Marx from Engels, who says, "The English working class has yet again disgraced itself by voting conservative." And Marx really had little useful to say about how market economies worked except from that angle. And of course, what we later think of as the institutions of Marxism, Leninism, like state planning and so on, were not actually part of Marx's early works at all. They were largely invented on the hoof by later people. Finally, and not finally, but penultimately, competitive capitalism. Obviously, competition is an essential element of the free market because, first of all, it makes it possible to have consumer choice. If you only have one producer, the consumer has no choice. Secondly, for the capitalist himself, it's a stimulus to hold down costs and to promote innovation. And thirdly, it prevents the monopoly exploitation of workers as well as of consumers, and it defeats the notion of economic rents. Competition is ultimately what makes free markets free. And there's the final term for it, namely Adam Smith's own term, the system of natural liberty. In effect, free market capitalism is what you get if you don't intervene in order to stop it happening. To that extent, the use of the word natural by Smith is perfectly correct. It's not a system invented by a few people around a government table and then imposed on the rest of us. It is something that has grown naturally as a social institution rather than a political one. I noticed that this is something that over the years the various popes have completely failed to grasp. They've talked about capitalism and free market, they've talked about capitalism and communism or socialism as two competing systems. Well, they're not systems of the same kind at all. The government, no one has invented, as Hayek pointed out, the free market. It's something the whole of humanity has invented. Now, what are the results of this? Here, as I'm coming to in a second, but in general. Well, compared to what? Other systems range, if you want to say whether the free market has done well or badly, you have to have some kind of system it's competing against. Other systems range from full socialism, full socialization of the means of production and distribution and exchange, through kind of state capitalism, to the spasmodic interventionism of some conservative as well as left-wing governments. In general, the answer is clear. The free market produces greater wealth, enables greater practical freedom, where do you want to live, which company do you want to work for, than any other system. And when we actually compare and contrast practical results in the real world, well, I'll give you two examples. Compare the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in 1989, which was a wasteland with a mal-directed investment, the production of huge amounts of goods that people didn't want and wouldn't buy, and the shortage of others, and a low standard of living. And then compare that with the last 30 years, 25 years, in which the 2 billion Asian workers, maybe more, who have entered the world labor market, and who were previously living in kind of stoic dependency and who now aim and get a middle-class living standard. Or, an interesting comparison, compare Thatcher's Britain with Gorbachev's Soviet Union. Thatcher's Britain was in a bad way when she took over in '79. Within a decade, she had made Britain the fourth, now the fifth, largest economy in the world, and the society had changed dramatically. I'll give you one example. When I left college in 1964, I didn't know anybody who intended to start their own business. In fact, the ambition of most graduates was to get jobs as management trainees in Imperial Chemical Industries or Metal Box Company. 25 years later, you couldn't throw a stone in Chelsea without hitting a Chelsea Arts graduate who was opening his own fashion boutique, or if you threw the stone outside Imperial in college or anywhere in Cambridge, you would hit a graduate who was just starting his own software company. In other words, not only had the economy improved in the sense of people living, having greater wealth, higher wages, but it improved in the sense of creating a more dynamic and innovative society at the level of psychology. Now, if it's that good, why isn't it more popular? Well, I think there are some general answers to that, and I'll just give one. We have mentioned that one name for the free market is private enterprise. Well, not everybody is equally enterprising. And there's no doubt that a free market society does mean that some people take advantage of opportunities that are theoretically available to all, but which psychologically don't suit them. And equally, socialist society can gradually train people to be inert, not to want to prosper, to want to, in a sense, get by with as little effort as possible, and that, which of course is enshrined in the famous remark about the communism in the Soviet Union and in these countries. They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us. It's a society which is that much more, so to speak, stolid and dull and unenterprising. On the other hand, there is usefulness to that. If you depress expectations, you comfort those who don't have any. And at the same time, the free market, therefore, produces divisions. Enterprising people do well, other people do badly. Some enterprising people do badly as well because luck is against them. In that case, you have divisions in society. Now, does it matter? Well, in a sense, it doesn't, in my view, it doesn't matter. I mean, I think concern about equality as such is a mistake. Concern about poverty, education, high standards, those things are very important. But concern about actually where the fact that people are placed at different points on the social or economic ladder, that is not important, to my mind. But there are some people who think it's terribly important and who base political careers on that question. So there is some prospect of conflict in society as a result of the free market, particularly when minorities do well in it. We see this in Asia with successful Chinese minorities who attract resentment from other people in the local population. And I forget the name of the lady now, but there's a very talented Chinese woman who, obviously being Chinese, knows a lot about the threats that Chinese people feel in that part of the world. And she's written a book, Markets and Minorities, which expresses this alarm. Now, what about here in particular? Well, of course, one of the points I've made relates directly to Central Europe, namely the point that we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. In this part of the world, when capitalism came in, the free market came in 1989, first of all, people had exaggerated expectations of what it could achieve. You do not yet enjoy the same living standards as the Germans and the Austrians. And many people thought that with the arrival of free market and democracy, you would. Now, that's a cargo cult idea of capitalism. Capitalism isn't a magic formula. It isn't something that arrives and opens the door of trucks, and the goods pour out to you. Capitalism rewards hard work, diligence, endeavor, and talent. If you don't display those things, you don't get the result. Secondly, what happened locally, so people had disappointed expectations. They didn't think it was going to be that it was going to be better than this. In fact, if you actually look at the performance of people of different countries in the last 25 years, you'll see enormous differences. Some have adapted better than others. I mean, obviously, Marek here in the audience can tell me that the Poles have done probably better than almost any other country. That I don't think would have been predicted in '89. The Hungarians did well initially, but have fallen back since. So again, people, in a sense, not only had personal disappointed expectations, but there's such a thing as national disappointed expectations. The second thing is these countries inherited a very, very difficult situation. Look at the Slovaks. They had huge Stalinist-type industries producing goods that nobody wanted. And now they're one of the most successful transitions. Why? Well, that's very interesting. I don't know the answer why the cause was so dramatic, but I can guess one reason, namely that once Czechoslovakia and broke in two things happened. First of all, there was no money arriving from Prague to keep these subsidized industries going. So suddenly the Slovaks had to turn around and get rid of ineffective investment, turn it to productive things, and produce a more efficient economy, and that's what's happened. The second is, I think myself, and this is speculation, but I think that the arrival of independence for the Slovaks gave them a kind of psychological boost. There they were, out in front of the world. They had to prove that they were going to do the job. And that kind of nationalist enthusiasm was actually put into economic effort. Now, let me just turn to a couple of points before I finish. We have to bear something in mind, which is, I should say, by the way, that people in Hungary live much better now than they did in '89. It's just that they don't feel that as much as, in a sense, a rational person reading an economic table would. But the attitudes have been shaped also by the recession that has followed the crisis, the crash of 2008. This, it seems to me, is always understated as a reason for the unpopularity of the free market. We actually produced, we held a conference in which we produced a book on this. Now, the biggest mistake, it seemed to me, that was made by people who have the opinions on this platform was that we didn't ever establish, or we didn't sufficiently rebut the argument that this was the result of the free market. In fact, when you look at the various factors that produced the crash, it was an example more of government failure than of market failure. I'm not denying any market failure, that existed in it, but the crash had, I would say, the following four causes. The first was the secondary mortgage market crash, and that was a highly regulated market, and it was regulated with a particular purpose of encouraging the development of the purchase of homes by people who couldn't really afford the mortgages. And as a result, with the support of the state and the intervention of regulatory authorities, prices of houses rose. And what always happens when you have these kind of tulip crises, what happened was people thought the price of housing will never, ever go down again. That for some reason, is a kind of part of, well, not invested, it's part of economic psychology, which recurs again and again throughout economic history. Well, of course, it crashed, and it was bound to crash when we consider that the state and agencies in America like Fannie and Freddie, were deliberately encouraging people who couldn't afford a house to buy one, and eventually the crash occurred. Secondly, the Wall Street and various investment bodies had married obviously shaky mortgage investments with safer ones in a policy which is perfectly rational normally, provided it's kept, namely spreading the risk. But they did this in a way which wasn't honest, and that led, and that is where the market failure came in. It led to an enormous expansion of malinvestment. That always happens in inflationary circumstances, but it happened worse then. Excuse me a second. It was very obviously a lack of commercial morality. Again, one only has to read some of the books by Michael Lewis to see that people were, in effect, buying themselves a big future a pension by defrauding their clients. And that is something which has got to be acknowledged. But it's a permanent element in human nature. And it cannot be separated from something else that happened. And that is that the Christian morality in the world, and its associated moralities in other religions, that has been in decline unfortunately, I would say, since the end of the Second World War. One understands why that might have happened, with reasons going right back to the First World War. But the concept of morality, or the looser concept of respectability and honest dealing, these were very firm foundations of Victorian economic life. They've been undermined. And we can't expect to separate out certain aspects of life, like, for example, economic decisions, investment decisions in Wall Street or elsewhere, from a general decline in people's honesty and openness. And the final factor was a monetary policy, which, in a sense, stimulated by the fact that there was a huge amount of Chinese money sloshing around the markets, monetary policy became very loose. I was surprised when the head of the Fed, Alan Greenspan, said that he was astounded by what had happened, because it was very obvious that the Fed was, in fact, quite deliberately intervening here and there to withstand attacks on particular institutions. So he could hardly have been astonished when eventually the tottering edifice of overlending began to collapse. So when there is a world recession that lasts for 8 years because of apparent manipulations of finance on Wall Street, you can't be surprised that people distrust the market. They have to live with the consequences. But it wasn't the market that was responsible for the crash. The crash was implicated. The market was implicated in the crash, but it was far more the result of government policy, perverse regulatory intervention, and failure of general commercial morality. The market will never be better than the people in any country, and that's true. We therefore have to, in a sense, go out and tell people that personal responsibility and personal honesty are as much a part of the market as, for example, pensions plans or anything else. Until we do that, the idea of the free market will be a free lunch to some people and a lunch which they never manage to get from others. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm always pleased to follow John, and John has, of course, given me lots of food for thought, and I'm going to comment on some of those things as well. Of course, almost nothing that he says would I ever disagree with, and true to form tonight. I would just say one thing about the free market that we should push continually is that the free market's tolerance of opposing points of view and other markets or other approaches, intolerance of free markets, is, of course, free markets' ultimate moral stance. And it's why I believe free markets are more moral than any other particular system, because they are tolerant of other systems in a way that isn't happening. People have touched a bit on some of the problems that we're facing, and I want to look forward a bit as well. And I think we're at a turning point, and it's a really important turning point. And people have been talking about capitalism and et cetera. I just want to cast your mind back a few centuries. And clearly people for many, many centuries existed in what I might call an agrarian type of society. And in those societies were not ones where there was a lot of excess profit, and so only a very few people lived particularly well. And from about 1830, we started to see the development of capitalist societies. And all of a sudden, it was the amount of money that you could gather together to invest and to use people productively to actually produce more goods and services. And that capitalism society has really lasted now for about 150, almost 200 years. But I think we're at the point where we're moving into a new, different kind of society, and I think it's an equally big, difficult transition, and for those who manage it, it's going to be great, and for those who don't, the world's going to look pretty difficult. And I think this is really going to be an intellectual revolution. And for that reason, I wouldn't want to say that we live in a capitalist society, because I think that increasingly in future, it's going to be intellectual societies, and societies that are able to harness the intellectual abilities of their people, that are going to be the ones that really, really prosper. And let me just bring in the European Union and what's happening with the European Union right now, because in many ways the European Union is facing an enormous test. The European Union has what they call a European social model. It's sort of the preferred way of doing things. And in many ways, it's a little bit like communism. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, communism was catching up steadily with that of Western Europe. The economy was catching up steadily. It never grew as big on a per capita basis as Western Europe, but it was doing relatively well. It was using more inputs to achieve the same degree of growth as we saw in, say, Germany or France or Britain or the United States. But it could argue that it was actually doing relatively well. And I think right now the European Union is facing a similar challenge. The reason I think that communism eventually fell was because their system simply couldn't keep up any longer, and it became obvious to everybody that the harder they tried, it just didn't make any difference anymore. Is the European Union at that crux right now? And I wonder if in the next few years, is it going to find itself actually incapable of coping with the information age? And that's going to be a real problem for them. We could see today, of course, the moves of the ECB. What is this designed to do? This, in my way, and we were discussing it just outside, this is sort of the death throes of the European social model. It's the trying to make sure that we don't need to reform, we don't need to change in Europe, because we can actually save the present model through monetary policy. I don't believe that's possible at all. I believe there's a much, much deeper, more widespread change that needs to happen to our society, whether that society be here in Hungary or in the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and other places as well. And that's an enormous challenge for the Europeans, particularly those Europeans who are very, very wedded to the type of market that we've had before. So as we move from that agrarian through the capitalist society and on into intellectual society, what are some of the things that are going to be big challenges for us? And I think here, it's the amount of information that we see coming down upon us. And the amount of, whether it be the amount of books that we publish, which has gone absolutely astronomical, increased by 7 times from 1945 or 1950 to 2000. They don't measure, actually, the number of books published anymore because so many people publish online, and we know that that's just been another quantum leap in the amount of information. We know that people are more educated than ever before. Just in 1980, we had about 18% of Europeans had a degree. Today, it's 38%. So many more people, much more educated than ever before. And yet, at the same time, we seem to need a much larger welfare state than we've ever had before to take care of people, to take care of these educated, informed people who are capable of making choices in all sorts of their lives every day, but not in the case of various social services. I think that this type of model and this type of thinking is really, really needs to be shaken, and shaken very, very hard. I just want to pick up a couple points that John was making as well. And he said that not everybody is going to start a company, and I think it's absolutely true. One of the great privileges I have working with the Institute of Directors is to go around listening to very, very interesting people give interesting speeches. And one of the ones recently that came about talked about something called the explorer gene. And this really came about as a result of studies into the genetic makeup of people as they came through Alaska and then populated slowly down through the Americas. So this is obviously centuries and centuries ago. And they looked at it, and they were trying to look for genetic markers. And what they've sort of tentatively found, this is still very much in exploration in the genetic sciences, is that about 20% of the people have what they call the explorer gene, which is to say, they will say in their group of several hundred people in their small tribe, let's go look over the next hill, see what's there. And they think that 20% is absolutely critical as a number. Because if it was 1 or 2%, primitive tribes being what they are, somebody comes up with a different idea, they would simply be clubbed to death. And if it were, say, 50% of people, you'd be trying to herd cats, as we say in English. It becomes impossible because everybody's got an idea to go over this mountain or that mountain. So you can't, 20% is the perfect size because it's enough people that it isn't so strange that they've never seen it, but it's not so many that they become uncontrollable. And that explorer gene is really, really critical. Now, what I think happens as well, and this is the James Sproul thesis, is that the explorer gene and the entrepreneurialism are innately tied. And absolutely right, I agree with John yet again that not everybody wants to start a business by any means. People want to be successful in their careers, and what success looks like varies from person to person. I don't know anybody that doesn't want to be successful in their life, or if they do, they probably need to seek help. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean, truly, my wife is a psychiatrist. But what you do want is to make sure that the 20% of the people in your society are able to go out and actually embrace this new technological revolution. Because if that 20% of the people aren't able to do that, particularly at a time when we're building up new types of companies, new ways of doing things, if you miss that opportunity, I think European societies will pay a very, very heavy price for a very, very long time. So I would just end with saying, again, John said the market is never better than the people in it, but equally, I think the people can be far better than the government which represents them, and I think that's what the challenge for Europe is, because I have an enormous amount of faith in Europeans, not quite so much faith in some European governments. Thanks very much.
Good evening, everyone. So, indeed, with Open Europe, we campaign for reform of the European Union in order to turn it more into what you could call a free trade EU. Now, basically, the core of the EU project, I think, is indeed about peace. You often hear Eurocrats saying that to justify then all the things they're doing, but they never or not often explain that they actually want to achieve peace through trade. So the idea is the EU lowers barriers to trade, and this makes it less likely that countries would go to war. And this has been a great success. So this core of the EU has been achieved over the years, basically through applying the method of mutual recognition of standards. Now, if you ask yourself the question, how can we make sure that an architect from Hungary can operate in another European member state, then there are two main ways of doing it. And one is simply if that architect goes to Slovakia would basically allow this person to operate there and basically recognize this architecture degree, at least as long as the person, of course, respect all the safety regulations in Slovakia. So I'm putting it a little bit black and white, but this is largely how the EU has been functioning till deep in the 80s, 90s and bit. Now, the other method to open up trade between countries is if you basically harmonize rules. If you come up with a common EU rule of how an architecture degree should look like, and obviously if you do that, then it doesn't need much explanation that eventually you're going to end up with a whole monstrous body of regulations that will often be hard to get rid of and not very well adapted to the situation on the ground, given that it's all drafted at such a centralized level. With Open Europe, we came up with an estimate a few years ago that around 2/3 of the impact of EU rules is coming from the EU level. So where countries, of course, have input, but sort of it's the same rule for all 28 economies. And I think that figure alone should be proven itself that something is wrong. And the fact that the EU Commission has now as its number 2 in charge Mr. Timmermans, someone who is responsible for better regulation, is also proof that there's a problem somewhere. Now, I would argue that despite the fact that the EU has evolved from like opening up borders through mutually recognizing rules about trusting each other to more harmonizing rules in Brussels, I think this is still, like the core of the project is still delivering a lot of good to the EU economy, to citizens. Ryanair, for example, one example of how a framework of open trade between countries can actually deliver benefits for very ordinary citizens. Now, apart from that, the EU has also been engaging in a number of side projects. To be precise, 4 side projects. One, good, Schengen. I think Schengen is fundamentally a good thing. 3, bad. First, the EU budget, €1 trillion over 7 years. Second, very embryonic EU foreign policy, and maybe one day an EU army if you allow them to do what they want. And thirdly, then, fourthly, in total, the euro, which I consider a great failure. Now, first, Schengen. So, I mean, I don't want to develop this much, but I think it's obvious that if you would have border checks between countries on the continent, I'm not saying it would be a good idea for Britain to join. I mean, if you want to get to Britain, you always have to stop a bit. But if you would have like trucks lining up at the border, I believe last year Hungary had this for a very short time. I mean, you don't need to calculate that this is, the cost is going to be massive economically. Now, at the moment, of course, we have a major crisis with Schengen. Mr. Sarkozy, former French president, said that Schengen is dead, and he blamed Germany, which is quite something, actually, yesterday, I think, or the day before yesterday, saying that Germany had stopped applying the Dublin regulation, which means that a country, Germany, would only treat asylum applications from people if they prove that they haven't crossed another safe country first. Now, how do we save Schengen? Obviously, even European policymakers say that to protect the external Schengen border. I don't want to go too deep into this, but it's my opinion that we need to apply Australia's solution. What is Australia's solution and how is it different from what currently happens? Well, if you're a person who comes from Turkey, you cross to a Greek island, the consequence of being caught entering the EU illegally there is that you can just travel through. It is true that now the Balkan route is closed, but still what should happen, I think, is that people who enter EU territory, I don't think they should be sent back to Turkey. Turkey has low standards, but they should be asked to wait somewhere to await their asylum application. Of course, this is going to cost a lot of money, but if you look at how much money has been spent already to deal now with this massive crisis, then I don't think there are any cheap solutions, at least if you want to keep the asylum right to a certain extent in place. Now, then secondly, one of the bad side projects of the EU, Zoltan already mentioned how EU regional funds strengthen autocratic systems. I imagine you're talking about the Orban system. And I very much agree with that. Also, in Romania, for example, it's clear that corruption has been increasing as a result of the fact that the EU has showered that already very vulnerable system with a lot of money. So I don't think it has done much good. From the €1 trillion, that's 1,000 billion, that the European Union is spending over 7 years, not less than 270 billion goes to subsidies, funds for agricultural landowners. For example, the Queen of England gets a lot of money because through the National Trust she owns a lot of land. Banks own a lot of land. In Germany, the biggest recipient of these agricultural funds is Südzucker, a very big industrial conglomerate. This is crony capitalism at its worst, and it's incredibly hard to get rid of it, but that's a wrong side project of the EU, which in my opinion has nothing to do with opening borders to trade. Now, I won't go too deeply into the EU budget, but then of course, foreign policy. You often hear in certain countries, not in Britain, but countries, my own country, Belgium, that it probably makes sense to have a common foreign policy given European states are so small, etc., etc. But then if you actually look at what public opinions in different countries, at what governments think in terms of foreign policy, what is the right solution, you can discover very wide differences. For example, the issue of foreign intervention. Should we intervene into Africa to sort out some things? Typically in Britain and France, voters and also politicians would be much more comfortable with that than in Germany. It's not that the Germans are wrong and the others are right. It's just there's a different tradition, a different background. So what the EU did is they basically have put institutions ahead of policy. They said, yeah, it's true that we don't really agree what kind of foreign policy to conduct, but we really want to have an EU foreign minister and a foreign diplomacy of 3,000, 4,000 diplomats. So they continued starting like this thing. It's only costing money. It's not really delivering something. And of course, the ultimate idea to have then an EU army, that this would mean that a politician from France could suddenly decide to send young Spaniards or young Finnish to go to fight, which is already a hugely controversial decision in the domestic political arena. So I think it's completely ludicrous that these things are being suggested. But the current Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, has actually suggested to have an EU army. So these things are on the table. They luckily have no chance at the moment of being pursued. But I don't think it's a good side project. I don't think it's something the EU should be dealing with. Well, then, last but not least, the last side project of the EU that I think is a big failure is the euro, the common currency. Now, why I think is the EU a failure? Simply because I think it has served as a debt machine. There's another, I think, problematic element to it, that you no longer have automatic currency adjustment. Like back in the days, if Portugal would be mismanaged, then investors would sell off Portuguese currency, the escudo. Portuguese people would become poorer, but it would also become more attractive to invest in Portugal, to go on a holiday there. So this kind of mechanism is gone, but you can sort of deal with that through internal devaluation, but then you need to rely on the politicians. However, the main problem is that the common currency has allowed, I would say, every single member, including Germany, to go much more deeper into debt than would ever have been possible without. Even if you would have the strongest hard money man as governor of the ECB, then you would have seen a massive drop in interest rates as a result of the fact that there is a common currency. How do I know that? Very simple, because the euro was started in 1999, and already in 1995 interest rates dropped quite considerably. Countries like Belgium, Italy suddenly could enjoy lower borrowing costs. In all of these countries, you had the same dynamics. You had first a boom, and then you had a bust. The boom was either in public debt or in private debt. In Ireland and Spain, it was in private debt. In Belgium, Italy, it was in government spending, which eventually became also visible in public debt. So this debt machine, I think, is really has amounted to the first bailout of European welfare states, and worse, it is also endangering the original project it was built upon. EU politicians would have never managed to decide the euro without the success of the EU. What you see is that the euro has undermined friendship between Europeans. You can see all these bad images that the German and the Greek media have been portraying about Greeks and Germans, respectively. You can see how a range of crisis meetings really undermines the core of the EU project, or threatens to undermine this in the long term. So what is then the solution? Just dismantle the euro? I think obviously this would mean a massive cost. But last summer there was a possibility to perhaps have a middle-of-the-road solution to try to have something else than what they have been doing, which is to shift money, to organize bailouts, and to then intervene into other countries' budgets. And the idea was to then organize a Grexit. They came very close to it. They actually basically decided it because the Eurogroup, the meeting of finance ministers of the Eurozone, have been meeting without Greece. So what really happened last summer is that Greece was readmitted to the euro, you can argue. Now, you probably would not have needed to actually change the currency in Greece. You could have reverted Greece to Montenegro status, which means that Greek people would still keep on paying with the euro, but banks based in Greece would no longer have access to the cheap money canal of the ECB. Because when a country joins the Eurozone, for example, if Hungary would join the Eurozone, don't tell it to the politicians, but this would be fantastic news for politicians. The banks in Hungary would get access to the cheap money of the ECB. Of course, all this money would first go to Hungarian government bonds, always, and then probably secondly to the real estate market. But then, of course, given that it would be an unsustainably low interest rate, this would create distortions, misinvestment, which would then be solved by transfers with foreign policy intervention into the Hungarian budget and all the rest of what we have seen. In Greece last summer, there was an option to actually, German Finance Minister Schäuble even suggested to provide 50 billion euro for the transition to the new system. It was chosen not to do it, given that Angela Merkel was afraid of Portugal also leaving the euro after that, or leaving sort of, so to speak, the euro system, so the banks there wouldn't have access anymore. We're a little bit in a pyramid game in the sense that the debt is so big that politicians are afraid to actually pull the trigger. But perhaps if there's a big financial crisis, then in the panic overnight, they will go back to what they know, which is national currencies. And let's hope then that the core of the whole European project, the EU, will survive. I will leave it there. Thank you.